Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity where we're able to assemble here tonight and behold you and all that you have done and how you have brought about your people into a place where they may enjoy you and live for you and live in you. And Father, as we get to participate in that, I pray, Father, that we too, tonight and tomorrow, will enjoy you and live in you and for you. We thank you for this night. We thank you for each other. We thank you for this time, Lord, where we get to celebrate you. Open our hearts and our minds up to you now, Father. And it's in your holy and precious name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
We've heard a lot of wonderful things this evening already. Jackie splendidly started us off by clarifying that this dual celebration this evening of the Passover and the Lord's Supper is a holiday of hope, shaped by two stories of people who are moving from slavery to freedom. Both Marie and Debbie then regaled us with the Passover story of how God demonstrated, or how God remembered his covenant agreement with Abraham to deliver his people Israel from slavery in Egypt to a freedom that would be framed in holiness. And finally, Kurt explained to us how through the Lord's Supper, the church looks back to Christ's cross and resurrection in order to live forward in God's freedom of forgiveness. There are a lot of wonders at work in what has been shared and experienced tonight. And so what I would just like to do now is take a few moments to pause and reflect upon some of these inherent wonders, and much like holding a diamond up to the light and being mesmerized by its every sparkle, just be able to appreciate how the glows emitted from this evening radiate the glory of God at work in this world. The first wonder we might glean from this evening's service is the overall recognition that God is Lord over history. That God is Lord over history. I know that might be difficult to believe because every time we turn on the television or read the news, the affairs of the country and the world seem so all over the place and disordered that chaotic is the only word or the closest word we can think of to describe it all. And much of that perceived chaos we see and hear of daily is hardly unique to our time only. It is seen throughout history. Domination, oppression, injustice, suffering. Horror is humanity's longest lasting legacy in history. And yet we say and we pray that God is Lord over history. But how in the face of such horrific history are we able to say such a thing or to pray it so defiantly? Because as we have remembered here tonight, as God powerfully inserted himself into the affairs of the Egyptian and Roman superpowers of the day, sovereignty belongs to God alone. When God used plagues in the Red Sea to completely destabilize Egypt's economy, their military, and their national morale, God demonstrated his supremacy, how his supremacy supersedes any presumed national sovereignty. And when the Roman centurion stared up at Christ on the cross and declared or confessed that surely this was the Son of God, it was a concession speech that Rome and Caesar were not, in fact, the pinnacles of power. And so it is in these stories we have heard tonight that we must recognize, right along with Egypt, Rome, and Israel, that God is Lord over history. And through God's sovereign lordship, we also begin to understand that more than just horror is at work in history. God is at work in history. This work has a word, That word is salvation. In simple terms, salvation essentially means to be saved from a bad situation for a better situation. But our stories tonight have given context and value to that definition. First, God established salvation for his people by saving Israel from slavery in Egypt for freedom in the Promised Land. And later, through Jesus, God expanded salvation to the world by saving humanity from slavery to her own sinful nature for God's holy nature. Now, sin may have defined history, but God's salvation is now refining history. These meals that we have commemorated here tonight are markers of God's salvation work that God is sovereignly unfolding in history. The Passover and the Lord's Supper remind us that everything going on in the world does not dictate all of reality. Even though the world insists it is what it is, these meals, it declares that it is so much more. These meals break the spell over our minds that reality is all about oppression and it's all about injustice and suffering and horror, and they instead announce that hope abounds in history because of the God who abides in history. And just as these meals remind us of what we are being saved from, they also point us to what we are being saved for. When the lifeblood of the pure and spotless Lamb was shed to spare Israel from the angel passing over, it was so that the life that they went on to live would be characterized by that Lamb's spotlessness. And when Jesus' lifeblood was shed, it was so that his followers would go on to live life in a way that is characterized by his holiness. Therefore, finally, God's salvation work sets us apart for his holiness. When Israel was led out of Egypt and into the desert, God revealed to them that their freedom was to be framed in holiness. In Exodus 19:4-6, God tells them, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And when the early Christians were later scattered throughout the world, the Apostle Peter echoed God's words by writing to them in 1 Peter 2:9-10. You, and by all means, feel free to hear these words as written for yourself. But he writes, "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Amen. For once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God." God's salvation work has called us out and set us apart so that how we live may demonstrate a better way of living than what the world has so far illustrated throughout history. A better way of living whose uniqueness is rooted in God's righteousness. A way that cultivates God's righteousness within the community he has called out. This community is the church, the new Israel, a redeemed people group whose lives bear witness to the salvation work God is effecting throughout the world. The culture of the church, or the way we live, is to reveal the reality of God's redemptive rule. to embody the holy character of Christ, through whom all things in history are being brought into subjection. Now, if you look at the screen above, I have created something of a rough historical timeline. There's over 4,500 years, give or take, of history on this timeline here. And as we consider the scope of this historical timeline, a lot has happened in these 4,500 years. Many civilizations and cultures have come and gone. Many of them have made lasting contributions. But all of these cultures and contributions were inevitably built and maintained through various forms of domination, exploitation, oppression, and suffering. However special they may seem, human horror has always eventually characterized them. But these meals that we have commemorated this evening, they mark the salvation that God is working out in history. They demonstrate that history is not without hope. That as history unfolds, God's salvation hope unfolds with it. We are the ones who give witness to that hope. April 13th, 2017 is where we are tonight, giving witness again to all that has come before us. By celebrating these meals together here tonight, we are testifying that we are witnesses of the salvation hope God is weaving throughout history. We are testifying that what we do here tonight is a part of what God has been doing yesterday, today, tomorrow, and forever. These meals connect us to the movement and community of God's salvation, so that as history continues on, hope continues with it. So as our celebration this evening leads us into Good Friday and Resurrection Sunday, let us proceed with wonder, so that every word of prayer, every song of praise, and every act of love, obedience, and worship may permeate our awareness with an awe of the one who is making all things new. Amen.